Welcome, everyone. My name's Chris Kerr, Executive Director of the Ignatian Solidarity Network, and it's a pleasure to have such a robust group of folks from across the country. I recognize a lot of names, not just from Jesuit higher education, but also from many Catholic institutions, as not just higher ed, but I even see a few secondary ed folks, some folks that work in parish life. So welcome. The Ignatian Solidarity Network was founded in 2004 as an organization that would bring people across different types of ministries together around the work for justice. Our work started out working predominantly with Jesuit institutions, but has grown to welcome people who seek to work for justice through the Catholic social teaching tradition, through the lens of Ignatian spirituality. So really glad to have such a robust group of folks here with us today for this topic, for Susan and Annie's presentation. In the context of Jesuit higher education, in 2001, Father Kolvenbach, then the Superior General of the Jesuits, gave a well-known speech about the role of solidarity in Jesuit higher education. And that speech has become kind of a paramount piece of lore, I guess, in the work of Jesuit higher education around the idea of how students are formed. And there's a phrase in there that talks about helping students to engage in the gritty realities of the world, to deepen their understanding of the reality of injustice and help them to develop the skills to utilize their faith and their values to work for a more just world. And that all sounds good, right? We want to help young people, understand what the challenges that people face in our world, but in doing so, we don't want to perpetuate the injustice that exists, right? We want to create programs that are not only vibrant, but also working to overcome injustice, not just through their goals, but how they operate, the ethos of them, what is inside them. And so really grateful to have Susan and Annie with us today to help us dig into this in the context of race and privilege and its role in our programs and the ways that we can address the realities of racial inequality. We can address the realities of white dominance in society, and invite students into the complexity of our world and the complexity of racism that exists. And so really grateful. I was asking Susie and Annie before we got started if this was the first time they had shared, kind of talked publicly about the paper that they wrote, which many of you hopefully have maybe seen or looked at. And they said, well, no, we've been talking about this for a number of years, back to 2018, I think Susan mentioned was one of the first times she presented on it. So really grateful that it's come to this point where it's this well thought out document that can be talked about here today. And I think the one other thing I'll say just before I turn it over to Susan and Annie is just that I think that there's so much good in these programs that happen in our institutions, right? And sometimes it can be challenging to dig into where they need to grow or where they need to evolve. And so I just really appreciate all of you being here today, wanting to kind of do that hard work, and just excited for the potential impact on your programs across the country. So again, welcome to those just joining us. Welcome on behalf of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And Susan, Annie, I'm going to turn it over to both of you to begin today's presentation.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Chris. All right, I'm now going to share my screen. So let's cross our fingers for no Zoom faux pas, even though it's been 2 years now. I think I would have mastered it. All right, are we good to go? Can we see a attractively designed set of PowerPoint slides? Wonderful. All right, welcome everyone to an examination of whiteness and alternative break trips. Introduction of myself. I'm Susan Harman. I'm the Associate Director of Loyola University Chicago Center for Engaged Learning, Teaching, and Scholarship. I run the university's service learning program, and I coordinate our faculty development programs. Previous to that, I spent a little over 10 years in active ministry, mostly in campus ministry at Jesuit Apostolates. I'm also a doctoral candidate in the philosophy of education and a practicing and licensed therapist.
My name is Dr. Annie Selak. I work at the Georgetown University Women's Center. I'm a Catholic theologian. And prior to studying theology, worked in Catholic lay ministry for several years, which is where Susan and I first initially crossed paths. And we wanted to start out today actually by naming some of the places that we've been for a few different reasons, right? One, what alum of Jesuit schools are not very proud of where they are, right? It took everything in me not to unmute and have Chris say where Father Colvin Bach gave that address, because it was Santa Clara, where I am a graduate, right? So wanted to share these places that have shaped us, but two, to also outline that our approach today, and when we're drawing upon case studies of spring break trips and immersion programs and alternate break programs, we're not doing a takedown of where we're at right now, right? That we're drawing from many different life experiences at different schools where we've been, that we've worked with as collaborators. So this is not a focused study on any one place, but looking at the diversity of the way that these trips occupy really important parts of life at a variety of schools and churches and colleges, universities, and high schools, right? Where we both did Jesuit Volunteer Corps, which I think was very formative of what set us on paths now, yet we also have questions about how that functioned and what whiteness looked like in programs like that, right? So here are just some of the experiences that we're bringing with us today.
Great. And I would be remiss as someone who works with educators to not start first and foremost with our learning outcomes. So here are some of the things that we're going to be shooting for and hoping that you will walk away from. It'll also give you a sense of sort of the scope and what we're choosing to focus on. So if you came with another desire looking for something else, I would say I'm always happy to continue this conversation. I don't want to speak for Amy, but I would assume as much as well. But this is specifically what we're going to be looking at. So again, getting folks familiar with the definition of whiteness is understood as a verb. We want you to reflect on the ways in which whiteness has impacted and continues to impact the practice of service immersions. And we're hoping that you will be able to articulate at least one practice that either will or already does combat a white supremacist framework in service immersions. So that is our hope, and that's what we're hoping to equip you with at the end of this. I'll flip it over to Annie for our why.
So again, why this topic? First, service immersion were central in our own development, in our own lives, right? I can think of, when I think of my time at Santa Clara, some of the first things I think of actually are immersion trips. So the relationship between Santa Clara and Dolores Mission, and spending time in Los Angeles there, a trip to Immokalee, Florida, working with migrant farm workers. Again, our own experiences of Jesuit Volunteer Corps. But these experiences were very formative in our own lives. And I think they're also things that raise questions in us now, right? As people who then coordinated these trips at other universities, seeing the way that students engaged in these programs in life-changing ways, and also sometimes in really problematic ways, right? So looking at our own experiences is very much grounded in experience, as well as looking at the changing and evolving field with a variety of ways to practice, right? So our own understanding of what it means to build programs that are anti-racist and looking at that. So really, this is grounded in a deep love and respect for these programs and wanting them to be carried out in a way that is anti-racist and doesn't perpetuate systems of whiteness.
So again, we both come from a deep foundation in Ignatian spirituality, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't take an opportunity to sort of invite everyone to dispose ourselves, right, and to think about how we're going to enter this conversation. First and foremost is leaning into the discomfort, right? This is a really essential topic, especially if you're white identified. There's a likelihood that you might be made to feel incredibly uncomfortable by some of the things that we might talk about. Wouldn't it be so ironic, right, if while we were talking about programs whose taglines tend to encourage people to become uncomfortable and lean into discomfort, if we would refuse to do the same thing ourselves? So just to remember that the same things that we appreciate about these programs, we should do ourselves when engaging with them. The next piece is just to acknowledge our own identities and positionalities, right? We're bringing our perspectives and our experience, whether it's been our histories with these programs or especially so Annie and I both identify as cis white women, and that is part of the lens and the biases that we bring to this work. It's also part of why we firmly believe it's essential that we talk about this work, right? As someone who's benefited from white supremacy unintentionally, but still benefit yet from it, has benefited from programs that were rooted in white supremacy and impacted by them. It, for me, is essential that I do the work of talking about it and attempting to dismantle it where I can. So thinking about how your own identities impact the way that you regard and think about this issue. Just a note to say, these critiques are not personal, right? Annie talked about the fact that this is not a takedown of a particular program. We are talking about our own lived experience. One thing I forgot to mention is in my 10 plus years of campus ministry, my primary roles were running these trips, right? At one point in time, Loyola University Chicago's program was running 18 of them. So I had all the opportunities to make mistakes. So if you feel like, like something is coming across as a personal critique or attack, unless you're Annie or myself, I promise it is not. Because we may mention our alma maters and our own experiences. I'm going to be bringing up some documents which I will share with you, just sort of what was presented. But in terms of critiques, I'll be critiquing my own work, right? I'll be critiquing that specifically. But as a therapist, right, I'll share with you the same thing that I share with my clients is if they get really activated or start suddenly personalizing something that I've shared, I see that as a wonderful opportunity to explore where there might be some tension or something that needs to be attended to. So if you suddenly find yourself being critiqued, unless I specifically call out Aaron McDonald, former coworker from Wheeling Jesuit University, I promise it's not a personal attack. Erin led many a trip with me, God bless her. But these are not personal critiques, but I would say if you begin to feel that way, pay attention to that. Where might that be coming from? What might that be pointing to you towards in terms of a really beautiful invitation from God to do more work? And then finally, again, we know that these experiences were incredibly powerful for folks. Again, one of the reason I'm standing here today and not a journalist or a lawyer is because of the experiences that I had on service immersion programs. That's what led me down this path through Jesuit education. As a result, because these were so formative for many of us, and we've seen them be so formative, it can be very hard not to have a very strong attachment to them. And in that regards, I would really invite us to reflect on the wisdom of, again, the first principle and foundation, the FPF, as I've abbreviated there, from the spiritual exercises. Chris and Aaron, I might trouble you all to drop the link to the first principle and foundation into the chat. Again, it's at the core of the exercises, and it really reminds us that we were created to love, praise, and serve God, but that all things in our life are meant to lead us deeper into a relationship with God. But sometimes something that brought us into a relationship with God over time changes and it doesn't anymore, right? Or we move to a different place and God is inviting us to see it in a different regard and way. And so for us to just think about attachment, right? And think about the attachment we have to things. And if you're feeling tension in that or difficulty, I so deeply empathize with you. Believe me, I empathize with you. As a queer woman who worked in campus ministry for over a decade, believe me, I am intimately aware of what it feels like to believe that there is something good and essential and important about work, but also really deeply wonder and have to face the reality that the thing that you're participating in might be deeply harming people. and communities that you're a part of. So I empathize with you. I hold, believe me, I know that pain and the difficulty in that, but I would invite us to engage it anyway. All right, and I will flip it over to Annie.
Okay, so we're going to start out today by walking through what is whiteness, right? Because we all have different understandings of this term, and so let's build a common understanding. So then that way, when we apply whiteness to these trips, we're kind of working with a common framework. Okay, so talking about whiteness can be really, really difficult, right? Let's just name that. That this can be really difficult. And that's also why this matters, right? Again, Susan and I are both white women doing this work. So let's just, again, we invite you to lean into this discomfort. Okay, so what is whiteness? In doing this work, right, we can look in so many different directions. Where I'm looking as a theologian is primarily like in theology and philosophy. So I find that Audrey Thompson's definition is really helpful, where she argues that whiteness is best understood not as a noun or an adjective, right? So not like what is whiteness, as I phrased this conference, but she proposes it as a verb that involves controlling symbolic forms of dominance and privilege, so that white set the standards for beauty, intelligence, and morality. I'll read that again. So whiteness is not a noun or an adjective, but it's a verb that involves controlling symbolic forms of dominance and privilege, so that white set the standards for beauty, intelligence, and morality. So let's start out with that first part, right? What does it mean to control symbolic forms of dominance and privilege? And we can go to the next slide, Suze. So whiteness benefits from an invisibility. I think that's the first thing I want us to understand. So if you're sitting there thinking like, our trips aren't marked by whiteness, like they're just neutral. Well, neutral in the United States, which is the context that I'm from and Susan's from, so that's what we're speaking from. Whiteness in the US masquerades as neutral, right? It benefits from an invisibility. We don't see its mark places, especially for people who are white. It just looks like the way things are, right? So even let's look at the norms of whiteness in this presentation today, right? So first, the form. We presented this paper at 2 different conferences. Then we wrote a paper in a peer-reviewed scholarly journal, and now we're adapting it to a Zoom webinar where the 2 of us are kind of talking heads. And when we need to appeal to sources, right, when we're making a challenging point, we appeal to a source. We name this source. With the pattern of speech that we have, the dress that we're in, our patterns, right, like the way that we speak, these are all forms of whiteness, because this is how expertise is conveyed in whiteness, right? So that's, but it might just appear to you as normal, right? We're not electing saying, here, we're going to appeal to sources of whiteness. We're just saying like, this is what structures US society, especially in higher education, right? When we talk about whiteness, I want us to look at structures of power and privilege. So what are the structures that give certain people a leg up? What are the structures of power? Who determines, right, that our patterns of speech convey a certain expertise? Who gets to determine? Who gets to call these shots? Who determines the rules of the game? That whiteness creeps into these powers, into these structures. And in fact, it doesn't just creep in. These structures were built by whiteness, right? The university system was built by whiteness, and then reinscribes these patterns. So we're primarily looking at structures. We're not looking at the specific color of a participant's skin, right? So when we're talking about whiteness, we're looking at structures, invisible structures. Some of your programs, the participants in it might be all white, you might have no white participants. My hunch is, looking at just like demographics of Jesuit high schools and universities, that it's a mix of all different backgrounds, right? And we also want to consider intersectional identities, right? And this is part of why we don't just look at what is the skin color of people, of the participants in it. But we know that socioeconomic status is a huge former of identity. I think one of the first questions we always get in this is, well, like, what about trips to Appalachia, right? Which is a predominantly white region that is severely economically depressed, right? Of course, these are things that we should consider. Of course, whiteness functions differently in that context than it does going to Haiti or going to Belize or going to Los Angeles, right? But our thesis here and what we're working with when we're talking about whiteness here is that whiteness as a structure still impacts these trips, right? They're still conducted and shaped by, informed by whiteness. So let's talk more about this a little bit more.
Quick comment, Annie, if I might, just on your note about Appalachia and those trips and whiteness. So I had the pleasure of working at Wheeling Jesuit University for 2 years where I led trips. And when I posted this article, once it was published up on Facebook, a former student of mine who grew up in a holler in Appalachia, had not talked to you in 10 or 15 years, read the article, and we got into this awesome discussion where she talked about the fact, you said, I know that this was sort of talking about whiteness. She's like, I resonated with everything you were talking about because that was the way that I was treated in our community. And so again, just a personal anecdote from folks for whom, again, seeing and recognizing that structure and how it impacted her.
Great. So as we talk about whiteness, I think it's also important to talk about white dominant culture, right? Because white dominant culture is what's shaping a lot of these programs because it's what's shaping our schools, our universities, right? So what are some aspects of white dominant culture? So a sense of paternalism, which is tied to patriarchy, but also in these trips can tend to romanticize the poor. Any sort of othering is going to be a trait of white dominant culture. Power hoarding, trying to like hoard all the power for yourself, is white dominant culture. Transactional relationships, which is one of the central parts to that I'm concerned about whiteness in trips, is this transactional relationships. I go into a community, I perform a service, I get something in return. Maybe it's feeling really good about myself, maybe it's a line on my resume, right? But that all relationships are formed in kind of a transactional way, which is different than solidarity, right? So we can kind of compare and contrast transactional relationships and solidarity. White dominant culture is shaped by a binary thinking. And most importantly, perhaps, white dominant culture avoids thinking about race, avoids thinking about identity because it's uncomfortable, right? Willie James Jennings, who's a theologian who I draw upon a lot, talks about the commanding heights of whiteness, right? So again, anything that builds a separation between me and another, the sense of distance, the commanding heights that us in the academy can think about others from a distance, right? The image of the ivory tower, which, you know, has a very deep background, but right, the image of the ivory tower captures this distance that we can look at others from a commanding height, we can study others and keep a distance, keep a transactional relationship. So again, let's return to this Audrey Thompson quote where she talks about whiteness, not just as a noun and an adjective, but as a verb. And now I want to look to the second part of this. So Thompson says that whiteness as a verb involves controlling symbolic forms of dominance and privilege so that white set the standards for beauty, intelligence, and morality. So we're not going to talk about beauty right now. Intelligence is kind of what I was talking about and how whiteness is governing this presentation, right? But what I think is really interesting here is how does morality function in these trips, right? How does our understanding morality function? So for instance, I've seen at a number of Jesuit universities where going on one of these alternative break programs is part of the bucket list, right? Before you graduate, make sure you go on one of these trips. In reading some of the comments that people provided beforehand, I saw a few from people in high schools that, were saying like, we're concerned that a lot of our students are participating in these programs because they think it looks good on college resumes, right? This is how they're going to go and get into a good college. So the sense that participation in these trips is, people are coming to it for all sorts of reasons, right? And what does it mean to then enter into communities with the intentionality of like, I'm completing my bucket list item before I graduate, that I'm going to get into a good college because of this. Basically, are we using others as a means to an end? Even for people who come with a desire for service, I think there's a tendency to turn others into a means to an end in terms of their salvation. Are we using others who we're encountering on these trips to help us feel better about ourselves? That's something that really concerns me. I also think there's this tendency in some of these programs, again, whether intentional or not, sometimes these are the culture that we live in. We inherit these topics, these issues. But when we encounter others who are different, how do we assess their morality? Right. So I think of, I've both been a participant in a trip and I run these trips. So I think of sometimes the way we talk about where people get their food, right? So are people growing their own food? Are they getting food from a food pantry, from fast food? Are they cooking their food? I've seen people say, like, oh, it's so beautiful. These poor people grow their own food and they're connected to the earth, right? There's a romanticization of the other. And this romanticization kind of takes two different forms. Sometimes it's looking at one extreme and saying like, look, pulling out the stories of people and exalting how hard their lives have been. And using that then in their own, sometimes we're using it in applications to college, to Jesuit Volunteer Corps, right? How are we instrumentalizing others? But also, how are we just talking about that? Are we romanticizing people in such a way that it doesn't recognize their dignity, that it doesn't recognize their agency? Again, this question of how do we talk about when we encounter others who are different? How do we talk about people who work, who don't work, where they work, when they work, what counts as work? I think these are all ways that I've seen participants other the people who they're encountering on these trips. And it very rarely looks like overt racism, but it very commonly looks like othering, creating distancing, romanticizing the sense of people who they're encountering on trips. So at this point, what we want to do is, we know this is a lot of kind of content of what is whiteness. So we want to have you go into small groups to have a chance to talk about this. So in thinking about your own programs, and of course, we invite you to introduce yourselves, right? Share where you're coming from, what your context is. But we want you to think about how whiteness might function in your programs. And if that's a little broad, right, let's make it a little more concrete. So consider the following. Who's the insider? Who's the outsider? Who sets the standards and norms if you're taking a group into a new community? Who gets to set the standards and norms? Do you see the sense of commanding heights at play? And again, it's not just about race or socioeconomic status or the identities of the participants, but the matters in which our groups are entering other communities.
So Annie did such a beautiful job sort of highlighting these elements and components of both whiteness, framing it for us, but then also introducing this idea of the aspects of sort of white dominant culture and how it can manifest. One of the things that we think can be very helpful as examining how whiteness has been active and is active in alternative break trips is to look a little bit at some of the thematic movements that we've seen in sort of the histories of trips that we know of, both because, I think it's essential to sort of learn from our past, see where things have developed, but also because knowing that this may have been an operative framework that maybe you recognize either in the roots of your program or maybe one that's still sort of around that you want to challenge or question, I think it can be very helpful to sort of dig into that. So we'll be looking at that. And as I sort of move through the last 50 or so years, basically, of trips, I would encourage you to pay attention for some of the question elements of white dominant culture. And just really quickly, unfortunately, we don't have time for a report out, but if someone shared with you something that you found particularly invigorating or engaging that you would like to share from that discussion, please feel free to put it in the chat. And again, in a perfect world, we'd have all the time and space in the world and be able to engage more deeply with one another. So, how do I approach this? And our article goes into this in more detail, but using primarily discourse analysis. So I looked a great deal at both conversations and materials, conversations that I've had with previous individuals who ran and participated in these trips, the materials that they produced, but also a lot in particular of student publications and things that were coming out of the schools that were sort of doing and hosting these trips as well, especially the historical ones. So in some cases, I'm going to be giving you direct quotes about how people were talking about these trips. Now, I do realize you can say, well, this is what was said, but that doesn't reflect a person's interior reality. Well, of course it doesn't. But I think we need to think about how we're articulating and talking about these trips, because that's going to shape and frame how people approach them, but also potentially reflect biases, worldviews, and understandings that we have. So again, to sort of frame that as well. All right. So how did some of these begin? Boston College takes a great deal of pride in claiming the first recorded sort of alternative break trip in 1978. In BC, a student named Greg Casson, who's featured there, led a group of students to Vanceburg, Kentucky, working with the Glen Mary Missioners. Now, in talking to folks, experiences like this were occurring far before. But I think, again, Annie speaks to this element of sort of like, how come BC gets to claim that, right? Well, some of it was because they're the ones who, recorded it. But my own father shared, he was in minor seminary, and he shared about going on an experience which sounded a heck of a lot like an alternative break program when he was in high school in the 60s, in the wake, again, of some of the post-Vatican II reactions. So I want to acknowledge sort of the history that isn't recorded. If you know for a fact that your program, your organization, your school had pieces of these, I would encourage you to bring it forward. Let's talk about this history that especially I think wasn't recorded. And so who gets to be put forward and doesn't. Again, Greg's picture is there. Partially because Greg's picture showed up a ton in Boston College publications talking about those trips. And he is an excellent organizer, and certainly want to highlight two things. One, these earlier trips especially were very student run and organized, right? There weren't always, in many cases, a lot of sort of institutional support. It was groups of students saying, hey, we want to go down and do this experience. Now, some of it may have been that Greg's picture showed up in BC student newspaper because that's what they had on hand, far be it for me to besmirch fellow former student journalists. But also, I think it's interesting that in digging through 4 years worth of publications in and around that time, I saw this picture of Greg show up innumerable times, very few photos of the experiences that they had, right? Now we can immediately pivot to say, well, that's technology, that's the availability of these. But I think it's interesting that, again, the face of a white student, we're centering that. Another thing that came forward in some of the language that was used to articulate trips like these, I use sainted saviors and hopeless hosts, an awfully alliterative title, again, but one that tended to come up quite a bit. The purpose of these trips was exposure to poverty, right? There was the really very clear when it was articulated, we need to go, especially to places like Appalachia, inner city Detroit, so that people can become aware of the third world level conditions, that was the language that they used, that folks were living in. There was a sense of urgency and an attentiveness that was absolutely necessary to see the poverty that folks were living in. Almost all of this language was deficit-based. So folks who are familiar with this, deficit-based language is when you focus specifically on the lacks or deficits in a community. Now, the tricky thing with deficit-based language is in many cases, it does reflect a reality. It reflects the reality of lower literacy rates. It reflects the reality of food insecurity. but deficit-based language will not acknowledge any of, it tends to, again, also disenfranchise the communities that are being talked about, and doesn't sort of articulate or point to any of the action or positivity, or just really sort of effort and agency that many of these communities had. All of the language was deficit-based, and most notably, the communities were being talked about. There were no quotations from community members. If there were, the closest it came was usually folks were talking about the religious orders that very often these students were working with, right? So a level of remove to a certain extent from the community on the ground. Now, folks might fight me about that, because depending upon sort of where and when a community is, but I think that that's important to sort of acknowledge. These two quotes are two direct quotes from my own alma mater, Marquette University's description of their trips, right? So this highlighted the things that students were just incredible, right? So we should be focusing on them, the morality that they're exhibiting, again, that Annie highlighted, that there was no bar hopping for these students, nay, while others go to the beach, these saintly students serve. Again, awful alliteration that is so common in collegiate newspapers, but it really was, the focus was specifically on the virtue that was being manifested by the students who were going to an area that could only be described via statistics and in sort of a very awful way. So moving forward from there, right? And I also want to highlight too, I'm not at all saying that, and again, we're going back to this attachment piece, not at all saying that there wasn't incredible things happening with this, right? Again, I want to highlight, Greg organized this incredible program that has persisted through sheer force of will on his own, right? What a testament to the impact of one person, right? What a beautiful thing that students were able to have their understandings expanded, right? But it's important for us to also, again, hold what were some of the thematic tropes and things that were persisting that are in the heritage, right, of many of the programs that we run currently today. So we look in the 1990s, we see an interesting turn, both of the focus on impact and then on structure and organization. So in the 1990s, we see the formalization of many of these programs, right? They go from being sort of student-led initiatives and clubs to, parts of staples of campus ministry, especially amongst Jesuit schools. In particular, Breakaway, which is an organization that still exists, formed at Vanderbilt significantly because the chancellor of the university said, we really want to put money behind this, right? We want to systematize this and make this not only a part of the experience, but really commit to this and think about what it looks like to make an institutional commitment. Breakaway, for folks who are unfamiliar with them, really interesting organization. In particular, they look a lot at the intersection of some of these experiences and citizenship. So if that's something that you're interested in or haven't worked with before, I would recommend looking at their stuff. They also grapple with privilege. I think they would also be the first to say that this is an ongoing struggle with them as well. But especially if you haven't thought about the intersection of your trips and citizenship, I would point you to Breakaway. So a lot of the language in particular focuses on trip statistics, how many students are going, how many houses are being built. Again, when we look at aspects of white dominant culture, an emphasis on quantity and sort of spread and growth, right, rather than sort of drilling down to quality is a manifestation, or tends to be a typical trope of that. I'll point you back as well to a resource that I dropped in the chat specifically, and again, Tima Okun is a scholar who's written about this. That website is a really interesting and dynamic kind of breaking open of manifestations of what she calls white supremacist culture. But again, would sort of ask you to think about, okay, when we're talking and specifically again about like what is being accomplished, right? This important element and aspect of how much is being done, how big these trips are, how much is occurring, right? That was the focus. Now, interestingly enough, we do start seeing community members are becoming addressed, right? So community members are being quoted. They're able to articulate and talk about their own communities. That shows up in documentation. So they're moving from an object to a noun. That's really important in discourse analysis. So they're becoming subjects as we can see them in the way that we're talking about stuff. But there tends to be a polarization, right, in the way that they speak. It tends to only be expressing gratitude, which in many cases is just what sort of like bowls over students, right? Who you see from students, the focus, even as they're talking about the impact of their trips, they're really sort of honing in on like, oh, we're getting as much as we give, right? So there's this recognition of personal impact, of personal growth, but also this line about sort of this astoundingness of like, oh, these poor people were so joyful, or, they thanked me so much, even they lived in these indigent conditions, or, they shared with me what little they had. and sort of a mystification, right, on behalf of the student participants that the poor would be capable of joy despite their material poverty. So when we see community members talking, though, they're becoming subjects, right, which is great to see, and folks are recognizing that. But mostly when they're quoted, or mostly when they're spoken to or about, it's either to manifest the sheer joy that they have and experience constantly despite structural oppression that they suffer from on a regular basis, or it's despair. Again, we pivoted on the other side to despair. Another quote, this one again specifically from trips in my alma mater: "We'd have no hope if not for these kids, we've got nothing." Right? Nothing else. That's a quote that was highlighted, lifted up, celebrated, and sort of put forward by a program that I participated in while I was a student. So thinking about, again, the lack of recognition of sort of the full humanity of someone, especially when in many cases, a lot of these trips were now going to communities of color, right? What does this look like? In addition to that, we see a big expansion in international trips. So there's an attention and an attentiveness to a global consciousness around wealth disparity, which is really fantastic, but really complicates things in terms of what we're looking at and how, again, what is a mission trip and what is colonialism, right? That's a question I think we'll continue to grapple with. So moving on from the 90s, we're looking at the 2000s, and I would say that can be summed up by a look at solidarity, not service. So in particular, that's where you start to see a language shift in many of these programs start to change their names and change their titles. So they go from like service trip or sometimes break to they're a mission trip, they're a pilgrimage. In our original article, Annie and I specifically sort of grapple with the particularity of that term and just sort of the ways in which I think also whiteness can lead to ignoring sort of important historical contextualization of that, and what happens when we can sort of presume or call something a pilgrimage. We talk about immersions. I saw in the comments of folks who were sort of interested in this, that folks were sort of like, can we really call it an immersion if it's a week? That was what I struggled with the entire time I ran the alternative break immersion program and lost sleep over it every night, right? Could it be called an immersion when it is such a short period of time? We do, however, see a shift to, especially among documents and scholarship, talking about preparation, right? We go from just sending folks down and just get them down there, get them in contact with folks, get them to do the good work, to we need to think about how we're preparing them. We need to think about reflection, starts getting articulated and talked about as an important facet or feature of these trips. And on the one hand, right, so we're seeing a recognition of that, but again, how do we balance this? I'm doing this experience for others, but definitely all of this energy and attention is being focused and honed in on the participants, right? All of the time and effort is being poured into them. Also too, just because preparation exists doesn't necessarily mean that it was high quality. For instance, my preparation when I was a student leader at Marquette was hearing a Jesuit basically tell us the story about the time a trip went to New Orleans when they were supposed to be in Mobile working for Habitat, and just drank for 3 days and told us not to do that. So that was how I was prepared. So again, preparatory meetings look different. And I think that's also an important piece that comes into play. We also see folks start to question costs, right? And this comes especially, I think, around some international experiences, especially those who were focused on building or construction pieces. People start to ask really important questions around, we're spending all this money to go down to do this thing. Would it be better for us to then instead just give the money to the host sites? And from there, we see a shift in many cases, primarily in international sites, but in other ones as well, to, okay, this needs to be more about being with people, right? So we're gonna shift from service to solidarity. That's where the beginning of this comes from. We see more home visits come into play. But also we see a language about being a voice for the voiceless, right? I'm gonna go to this home visit. I'm going to hear someone else's story, take it back and convey it. I myself had the experience of telling someone that I was there to be a voice from the voiceless, at which she informed me that she had been speaking for the entirety of her life and that no one was listening. Again, sort of where does whiteness center, again, the voice of some of these participants rather than the voice of the folks who were participating with. The other piece of solidarity gets used and bandied about quite a bit. Solidarity is an incredibly rich and complex concept. And so it was this idea that solidarity is something that you can achieve after 1 week. Very few of these discussions or materials talk about privilege when it comes to talking about solidarity. And I think especially for white identified folks, the idea that you can sort of like put down one's privilege and walk into something, I think is sort of a problematic thing that needs to be critiqued. Specifically within the article, I talk a little bit about something I call cheap solidarity and cheap recognition. If you're interested in that, I would again invite you to read the article. I do want to highlight, because I believe he's actually on this call, Jimmy Menkhaus is a wonderful theologian whose work I specifically cited and utilized around solidarity, who recently actually published a book looking at these experiences and encouraging people to grapple with this. That's another great resource for you all. But the idea that solidarity is something that can be consumed, that can be, achieved after, 1 semester abroad or week, or that you can just choose to be in solidarity with someone. That there's no need to sort of like think about the dynamics of privilege or what that looks like. And finally, we start to see an awareness, and I would say just an awareness of trip participant demographics. That is sort of someone notices like, certainly don't seem to be a lot of folks of color on these trips, or we seem to have like a disparity in this. You see amongst conversations, particularly amongst folks who are running the trips, concern around that. So as we move into the last decade, we start seeing more critical lenses dropping down and viewing things. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to note about the 2000s is we see more and more of an emphasis on the connection of these experiences to learning. A lot of great publication from community-based learning fields that talk specifically about Jimmy Menkhaus's book. I'll let someone drop that in the chat. Thanks, Felicia, just saw that. There we go. So we, in the 2000s, we see again this connection to learning, right? These experiences are connecting back to learning. They're enriching the learning environment. So the 2010s, we're coming into a variety of more critical lenses start being dropped down and viewing these trips. One is, and I want to point up in the corner, if you're unfamiliar with that image, that's from an Instagram account called Barbie Savior, which specifically parodies and critiques sort of white savior narratives around immersion trips. I used it in formation of my trips and would recommend that you do so as well. The image below that is from a student newspaper where there's a student opinion poll that specifically says, skip the mission trips. They cause more harm than good. And that's one amongst many recent articles I've seen. So one, I think, to think about this, a post-colonial reading of missiology, so that's the study of mission within the church and theology, that folks have been writing about that for a while, but I think it starts to really sort of enter a more common lexicon of folks. It starts to become sort of standard for, again, many theology classes. Certainly it was a big part of Annie and I's M.Div, but that starts to move forward, I think, to an intellectual forefront. So how do we understand mission when we're reading it from a post-colonial framework? And how do we question whiteness in that as well? Folks really start to, because of the questioning, I think, that happened with impact, right? Are we actually making an impact? Are we actually making a change? Are we complicating things in many cases for our community partners? There's a lean into, okay, these trips are formative. They're meant to be formative experiences. You see that language coming up more and more. They're meant to be opportunities for dialogue. I know for myself, I can only think of one trip experience in which I can actually for sure tell you that students like definitely made a positive impact and weren't just sort of hosted well by communities. And that was right after the wake of Hurricane Katrina, when they literally just needed bodies to gut houses. And then I will be the first to say, I did not talk enough about race. I did not talk enough about the dynamics of the ways in which the hurricane and emergency recovery impacted Black and Brown residents in a very different way than it did white residents. I did a little bit, not nearly enough, but that's the only time in my decade plus amount of experience of going on and running trips that I can for sure say it was a positive impact, as opposed to we were invited to participate in something alongside a community who may or may not have been making work for us. Or it was an opportunity for dialogue and formation, which is where you see more and more of these trips begin to shift to. So this is about dialogue, this is about encounter. Language of encounter starts to come forward more and more. we do start seeing people start asking questions about privilege, right, in the past 10 years. Like, so what is the level of privilege both to be able to go on these trips? What is the level of privilege that's being revealed by encounters from these trips? Racial disparity of trip attendees goes from something that I think folks are aware of to like, oh, this is an imperative, actually. We need to really dive into this and examine this. Folks, again, are breaking open that illusion of impact and asking more and more about where's ongoing advocacy? What are we doing when it comes to sort of cracking that open? We start seeing more asset-based language about communities come forward, right? We're not just talking about the deficits or the lack in communities, but we're talking about the incredible work that they're doing, in many cases in the face of structural oppression. So there's a shift there. We also start looking at folks talking about, okay, what's community need? How does a community dictate what they need? How do we listen to that first? And also, how are we aware of community harm when we have harmed a community by what we've done and how we've entered in? And finally, I think also we're looking at the influence of both critical service learning and community-based learning concepts are starting to come more and more into alternative breaks. So, all right, with that, I'm going to flip it back over to Annie to talk about inverted hospitality.
Okay, so inverted hospitality is something that might sound like a fancy term, but I think it's a critical way of seeing how whiteness can function in these trips, right? Because now what we're moving towards is the practice. So we'll talk about inverted hospitality, and then we'll give you some key takeaways of how to make trips not shaped by whiteness. So inverted hospitality in general looks at who gets to determine the rules of the game, who has the power to dictate norms, and who is making who feel welcome here. So Willie James Jennings, again, in his book, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, he talks about how whiteness claims to be the owner of the space that it entered, right? So this is what we're looking at in trips. If your university is sending a group into another community, if that group then in this new community claims to be the owners of the space, then that's inverted hospitality. That's forcing the people whose community you're entering in, right? That's taking away agency, and that's claiming being able to set the norms, set the rules, right? So let's look at more of how this plays out. So it's, again, claiming the ability to set the norms. So what feels normal to students? And again, remembering that whiteness benefits from an invisibility. Whiteness looks like neutrality. It has the power to masquerade as neutral. So let's look at two case studies where we've seen this happen. So one is, imagine that a group of college students go to Belize on an immersion trip. And they're spending time at a Jesuit parish there, and they've been invited to be part of the youth group. Great. Like, so far, things are sounding good, right? There's a pre-existing relationship with the community. There's a connection with the Jesuit parish and the university. Things are looking good so far. And then at that youth group, maybe one of the students from the university trip says that, like, oh, let's start out with this icebreaker that we always do. It's so much fun. Let's teach it to you. And then they want to reflect on the gospel together. And so they go around and they take turns. They go in a specific order. And at the end of the event, the students from the US university say, like, oh, that felt just like home. This feels so great. Look at these connections we're building. Solidarity is great, right? But what about for the experience from the parishioners? Maybe that group, the activity that they started with, felt really disruptive. It didn't really follow the norms that they're used to. So that felt really out of place. And then normally for their gospel reflection, they don't go around in a circle. They kind of go back and forth, taking turns, whatever feels natural to them. So to them, that experience feels really displacing. That's just a quick example that I think illustrates how inverted hospitality can function, right? It's the university group, the outsider group coming in, got to dictate the norms, got to call the shots for it, right? Another example, I was with a group of postgraduate volunteer service from all different faith backgrounds, and we were doing an immersion in Nashville, and we went to visit Thistle Farms, which is a community of women who used to be in sex work and are grappling with addiction. So this is a group of people who were like in March of their year, right? So these post-grad volunteers were like in it. They've been formed. We're talking all about solidarity right here, the high hopes. And this community of Thistle Farms refused to let our outside group set the rules, right? So they started us out with their morning ritual, which was their morning ritual. And when the volunteers kind of were noticeably uncomfortable, they said, well, this is our community. The Thistle Farms women said, this is our community. Here's how we're going to proceed. You're welcome to be a part of it, but this is our community. And I watched around the room as this group of, 20 volunteers who, again, they are receiving the best formation we have to offer, are growing visibly upset because they're used to being able to take ownership of spaces in subtle ways. Maybe it's by singing songs they know. Maybe it's by the patterns in which we speak, right? These are subtle ways, but this community refused to play by the rules of inverted hospitality. And it was just as illuminating to see how then inverted hospitality, when it isn't allowed to happen, the discomfort that arises from it, right? And again, language is not enough to disrupt these patterns. So naming something an immersion trip, naming something a pilgrimage isn't enough to disrupt these patterns. I want us to be particularly aware of how inverted hospitality can be especially harmful in the context of colonialism, right? So if a university group goes to Red Cloud Indian School on the Pine Ridge Reservation, right? That's a pattern where the context of colonialism is especially important to consider, so that these patterns of colonialism can really, really be dangerous.
Annie, anything else on inverted hospitality? I don't want to cut you off if you got anything else. You good?
Go for it.
All right. Now we realize we're getting short on time, as always happens. So practical things moving forward. It's absolutely essential, and I know a lot of you all came in with that. If you read our article, we actually say, what should we do? Throw up our hands and liquidate the budgets of break trips? No, we're not asking you all to do this. I think it just becomes more and more important for us, again, to engage with this thing that we have an attachment to that can become such a strong conduit and ability to receive grace. How do we engage with it differently? So again, I want to emphasize to that, especially for folks who didn't read the article, maybe you skimmed a little bit. We do literally have very practical things. We're not saying that you should liquidate your budget. Here are some questions and pieces that we invite you to think of. This both comes from our own experience and then also some best practices from scholars as well. So first and foremost, what are your trip outcomes? Starting from the beginning, do they exist? Do you know where they are? How long has it been since you revised them? Chris and I were talking before the call began and was saying, so the irony that we're sort of talking about this when in many cases, so many of these trips have been on hiatus. And I said, well, what a wonderful time to revise your learning outcomes. Again, as someone who cares a great deal about student learning and that connection, the outcomes of your trip should be the core piece from which things are flowing. So what are those primary goals? Are they just exposure to the poor? And if that's what you unearth, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about how you articulate it? Do your trips have explicitly anti-racist outcomes? Do you talk about race? Do you talk about whiteness? What's in there? Dive down to sort of the core structuring of your trips and let's examine that. I know that I went 3 years at Loyola before I looked at mine, which is unconscionable in my mind in terms of practice, because it was essential in how I aligned to my work. Second of all, what scholarship influenced your program structuring and student formation? So I, again, would point you to community-based learning scholars who, again, are really grappling with this, this tradition of, okay, what does a mutual relationship look like? What does a reciprocal relationship look like? And that's not to say that there isn't good scholarship out there on alternative breaks, but there's a very rich and longer body of work around community-based learning. And also, too, are you reading BIPOC scholars and activists? Are you looking at what they're saying? Are you listening to some of the incredible spoken word stuff that's coming out of, in many cases, BIPOC activists? to share about the experience of having folks come into their communities? Is that informing, again, your trips and some of those pieces? So what scholarship is influencing you? Who's going on leading and running your trips? And again, I know that this might be a big question that many folks are thinking about it, but what voice do BIPOC students and staff have in your leadership teams, in your planning, and in your site selection, and your staff yourself? I am incredibly aware of when I was in campus ministry, the whiteness of all of my coworkers the entire time, and how that sort of influenced these trips. And the damage that we likely did and were unaware of. One of the things that I did, and again, this is this tricky thing where I'm not saying if something is right or wrong, but I went to my students of color and said, because Loyola is a very diverse school, actually. We have close to 40% of our students do not identify as white. Our trips were only coming in at about, like 10% students of color, 90% white students. And I talked to some of my student leaders and students who had gone on the trips who identified as individuals of color and said, okay, tell me, what do you think? What could be toxic about these experiences? What might be a barrier? What do we need to look at? How can I grapple with something? What am I not seeing, right? Because of my own biases and perspectives. And the student, one of them came forward and says, no offense, Susan, this is fine. It's just like a hella white experience. It's just a thing that white people do. And so we really sort of started grappling with, if this space is somehow to a certain extent inherently white, what would it look like to disrupt that? At the same time, I had incredible colleagues in our student diversity and multicultural affairs offices who were thinking about and had been commissioned and had a grant to do some work around the school to prison pipeline. And along with my student leaders, I approached them and I said, if we did a trip specifically for students of color, what do you all think? Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that's a good idea? How do you feel about it? If you do think it's a good idea, what considerations do I need to have? Do you have the energy, time, and bandwidth to work with me on it? And I was incredibly privileged that I got a yes. And so for several years while I was at Loyola, we were able to offer a trip for men of color and a trip for women of color. They went to nativity schools where they, worked with classrooms of students that in many cases looked like them. The schools were elated to have them, right? You see these, they talked about what incredible role models they were. And in many ways, these trips were some of the things that I was proud of the most. At the same time, right, there are so many questions that I still have about how I ran that program. And I think about the meeting that I had in which the now former director of mission at Loyola, upon hearing that I had done these trips, said, you should be ashamed of yourself. You're ghettoizing these students. You're keeping them, keeping them away from other students. You're, exacerbating their isolation. Really highlighting the ways in which this may have marginalized them further potentially. In response, also on my advisory board was Miguel Macias, who worked in SDMA and had led one of the trips for me, who is a Latinx man, who said, I'm going to challenge you on that. This was an incredible experience. It was incredibly restorative for him. And he talked about the community that had built, the space that he created, and that it really was an experience that he treasured as a staff leader. I think both of those things can be true at the same time. And I have to grapple with that, right? But above and beyond, I share this story with you to say, when you're thinking about the participation of BIPOC students and staff, what do those conversations look like? If you're someone who holds those identities, how does it feel to be having those conversations? And are you caring for yourself in this? What support do you need from your white colleagues? How are your trips funded? And I know for a lot of folks, they're like, don't get me started. I have no control over this. I appreciate that. But I do think it is a bigger question to ask. And just to say that the funding of these trips might be connected to or have roots in constraints and structures of whiteness, I think is just important to name, right? Is a disproportionate amount of funding responsibility falling on students, and how does that impact folks differently? I'm aware that we're running tight on time. I'm going to try to plow through this next slide or two to close us up, but then I know I'm willing to stay around for questions. I can't speak for Annie. So thinking about how is the money spent, where do honorariums go to? This is another, I think, a really important piece. Are you working with the actual community, or are you working with a community partner? In service learning, I struggle a great deal with the fact that in many cases, we are working with a community partner who's providing services to community members, but those community members are not represented in the staffing or leadership of some of these community partners. I think that can be happening on a very regular basis sometimes in some of the places, some of the very time-honored places that we immerse at, where the person who's staffing these experiences might be someone who has not lived there for longer than a year, was a postgraduate volunteer like Annie and myself. And what does that look like? If you're working with a community partner that isn't rooted or from the community, how did they solicit feedback? International Partners in Mission was an international partner that we worked with for a long time. I appreciated the way in which they went out of their way to also be very transparent about the way that they solicited feedback from the folks that we immersed with, that these women that we worked with and encountered had just as much of an impact on the formation of this experience as the staff did. Finally, what framing do you use for your host sites? Are they a community partner? Are they a host, right? The image of a host has a lot of, I think, really powerful images around formation and dialogue. Are they co-educators? Do you articulate the ways in which a community partner might be able and does educate students? And I think there's a great opportunity for disruption of whiteness of higher education within that language. That's the language that I'm biased because I use it in my service learning community. How would they describe their own role? There was a great question that was shared beforehand around specifically, is sitting back and letting sort of the host community a burden upon them? It might be, right? And I think that's why it's important to be in conversation with the community partner about their understanding. For other community partners, they might be like, no, we, similar to Thistle Farms, this is what we're doing, you're sharing in our life, we will be dictating this because this is our community that you're coming into. But I think asking those questions and asking the understanding of the community partner is important, as well as unspoken power dynamics. I surveyed my community partners a couple of years into my work, and one of the questions I asked specifically was, how much do you depend upon the financial contribution that our school brings? And several of our partners were like, we massively depend upon this, which I knew immediately brought into a whole different dynamic of power that we had to sort of discuss and settle with, as opposed to me being like, the site was less popular, we're just not going to go back next year, right? And then finally, I think, what's the connection you're making back to in-class learning, especially if you're at an education apostolate? We know we've gone over, unfortunately, we had more time for small groups. We had a whole section where we were going to go into the UAPs. I was going to give you a beautiful theological example of a connection between a Thomistic and a Pauline framework. So if you hang out, I can maybe give that to you anyway. But we appreciate that folks are sort of running out of time. Annie was able to throw some scholars up into the chat to make you all aware of. But I would say I can stay probably for another 15 minutes or so to take questions for folks who want to stay. Thank you all otherwise for coming. You have our emails, you have our Twitter if you want to engage further. Thank you for doing this work. Thank you for being interested. So just a quick note, I think as folks are leaving, just on the Thomas versus Pauline framework. I think a theological framing that might be helpful for some folks. So Thomas, again, notorious for doubting the resurrection, needing to sort of touch Christ's side to believe that he was resurrected, and needing that experience, needing that encounter to come to know Christ. That's an image that gets used a lot when we talk about our immersions, that need to encounter. I think it's important to note what Christ says afterwards, like, yes, I'm here for this encounter, you can touch my side. Blessed are those who heard and believed. Doesn't say, and shame on you, and you should be ashamed of yourself, and you're terrible for needing this. But he does highlight the very blessed and I think essential role on people who hear the testimony about the risen Christ and believe. And I think especially as a white identified person, I think it's really important for me to question, when do I demand an in-person encounter in order to believe something, as opposed to believing the essential testimony of especially folks of color who, again, are not voiceless, have been speaking. In many cases, I'm not listening to. And again, Christ doesn't say that Thomas should be ashamed. He doesn't say that that encounter isn't essential, but he distinguishes that. And on the flip side, right, you have Paul, preeminent apostle, never met the man in person, heard the voice. And then after hearing that transformative voice, had to grapple with his own experience of blindness, thinking about the ways in which he didn't see something before sort of moving forward within the gospel. That's a helpful framing for me as a person of faith that might be helpful for y'all. yeah, so that's my last bit. Questions? Erin, I don't know if you have something you can throw at us, or we can encourage maybe folks to throw stuff in the chat. Yeah, I'm seeing something from Sarah George talking kind of specifically about pre-trip resources. So I think unique perspective, right? You're the immersive site. I think my first question, right, on your end will be, what's the rootedness about sort of, what did the community of Vanceburg, what would they say that students need to know? So starting first and foremost from there, knowing Emmaus has sort of, Emmaus and Glen Mary has a beautiful history, but like, what is the immersive community first and foremost there? What do they want to communicate? I think good reflection formats, especially, are something that is always good to share with folks at sort of like base minimum. And I'm happy to send along a couple of specific models that take and expand that a little bit more.
Susan, it seems like there's a lot of questions about specifically the BIPOC group that you did for Immersion. So were you on it? There's people, you know, we're all in this time, we were joking before, like we're pivoting once again, right? We're in this time of pivoting, but people who are rebuilding programs, thinking about maybe incorporating that in. So it sounds like there's a lot of different questions around that. And if you have more information on that, or can share information, if you personally went on it.
Yeah, so I did not, right? So that was important to really, and really essential to preserve that space. I worked really closely with the staff leaders who were staff of color. Marcos Gonzalez, who is a fantastic member of the Jesuit community, and actually I think on ISAN's board, attended one. Shout out to him. Happy to talk about that program. I see other two questions I can kind of address just really quickly. Ivan Illich essay, To Hell with Good Intentions. I've used it actually specifically in a class on global awareness that our psychology is mandatory for our psych majors. Students have really interesting responses. One of the things that they tend to point out is that Ivan's not from that community, which I don't know that students would have pointed out 10 years ago, right? But I think they are far less startled, at least the students I work with, by it than students were 10 years ago, which is, I think, another kind of interesting component. They're like, yeah, absolutely. Like, these folks are presuming things. But yes, have still used it, even though it is getting a little long in the tooth in terms of time. Rich, you talk about how does Zoom tech inform your thesis? I think this is really interesting, right? You know, because when we talk about that encounter and the need for personal encounter, we want to hold, right, the importance and the essential, like we are Eucharistic faith, the importance of having that encounter and coming to one another. While at the same time, I think we can demonize technology rather than sometimes seeing its opportunities. I'm a therapist. I've been doing therapy exclusively on Zoom for the past 2 years. There are moments I really wish I was in the room with my clients. It's not different that much. It really isn't. Now that looks different. That's a different framework, right? But I do think Zoom allows us to have incredible moments of encounter and conversation with folks in communities that really can't be neglected, even though all of us, probably if we never had to step on another Zoom call again, it would be too soon, right? Like, at the same time, we need to be careful how we lionize in-person encounters, especially if the formation isn't there, or also, like, I don't know about y'all, but I definitely remember having an encounter with like a beautiful community partner in the middle of the day when it was 90 degrees out, and like having to kick the back of my students' chairs to keep them awake because they were exhausted. And so they had that beautiful in-person encounter that they'd no longer remember at all, as opposed to the other ways that we can encounter and sort of mediate that. Initial steps in terms of the BIPOC trip. Honestly, we had incredible, and this is what I say, we had incredible buy-in with our SCMA office from jump. And I would not have done it if I did not really have, I think, again, as a white identified person, the absolute, like, the gift and privilege that was leading alongside and creating that trip alongside them. With our sites, we worked with Nativity Jesuit when it was still primarily just a middle school in Milwaukee. And I was privileged in the sense that I knew the principal at the time. And then with, oh Lord, I'm forgetting the name of the school. This is terrible, it's been too long ago. Another Nativity model school for girls in St. Louis. And the staff members there were really willing to, a predominantly white staff, grapple with that issue with students. And I think that that was really important too, that the students were able to question the white staff and to sit in that discomfort with them and both push that staff and then also hear that staff reflect upon their own experiences.
There's a question about, inverted hospitality and working with having the local community take more agency and acting as hosts. And I think this one's tricky because, right, it's going to look different for every community, and right, communities aren't monolithic, right? It's going to look different for every group within the community. I think though some things that apply across the board are relationship, right? Some communities want to take this on. Some communities think that working with alternative break programs is part of their mission. And though, like, that is a key community partner. I think it's also really crucial to look at when are we adding extra labor to community partners to host us, even if they want to, right? Even if they financially depend upon it. A lot of times that's still a choice that they maybe feel like they don't have the freedom to make, to follow where the money is versus going where the mission is. So I think it's going to be really complex in all of these areas. But I think true relationships and partnerships is what we're striving for. And to have those honest conversations, I think, is also key. Susan, did you want to talk about that at all?
I think you nailed it.
Okay. Yeah. I think in this too, one of the readings that we recommended is Austin Channing Brown. And in that, she talks about her experience of running programs for groups, church groups coming in. She was working at a church. And her writing, like, I'm thinking of her memoir, right? It's not about here's how to run a good program, but in hearing her experience as a Black woman talk about the extra labor that white groups would put on her, I think that, like, there are different entry points to learning more about this, right? So that's part of the reason I recommend her work, because she's putting it out there, like, in her own autobiography. But I think it's capturing a lot of the systems at play, especially as we're talking about race, the intersection of race, gender, class, religion, right? And how those all factor together.
I think also doubling off that, again, the importance of reading and scholars of color and looking at that for folks who are running these programs, who are from communities, who are practitioners, who are individuals who are BIPOC identified. Tell us, right? Like, Annie and I are doing this work, specifically talking about whiteness, because we know it's absolutely necessary for the work that we need to do, right? Like, what would you change? What have you noticed? You are going to be seeing things. There's going to be essential elements and pieces and perspectives of the way you might want to shift a trip, or the things that you struggle with the most that are absolutely essential, that probably are not being listened to enough. One of the scholars I cited, Marisol Morales, is a community-based learning scholar, and the majority of her work is looking at what service learning looks like at Native colleges, HBCUs, and Hispanic serving institutions, because she is really curious to see when the environment is shifted and changed, when we can sort of hopefully move away a little bit from some of this, like, whiteness, at least on the surface. Does it change the way we deliver these programs? Or does something in their structure, right, sort of like keep reinforcing these elements and levels of whiteness? She's still in the process of sort of churning out this research. I'd like chomp at the bit every time she publishes an article, but I think these are really important questions to ask as well, right? Like, for folks who are coming from institutions that are not predominantly white, do you do things differently? If so, how? What is the sticking points for you that maybe are troubling? What are the pieces that feel very much at home? I think this is a voice that absolutely needs to be amplified.